Yes, it's time for another Puscast. I'm going to cover the first 2 weeks of December 2015, and this will be the last Puscast of the year. My next one will be done over the New Year's weekend. Technically, a new year. So, I'd like to wish all my listeners a generic, non-denominational, seasonal greeting and toast you with a red Starbucks cup. But you're here for infectious diseases. So let's move on to the literature, shall we? As always, references are available online at edgydoc.com, where you will find links to my growing multimedia empire. And in this holiday season, what would be a finer gift for friends or family than copies of The Pus Whisperer, available at Amazon? As I have said before, what good is having a multimedia empire if you can't pimp yourself? But let's get on to the ID stuff. I suspect this is going to be a very short Puscast this time, as I really didn't find a lot, but I do have the ability to ramble at length, so who knows? So far, it seems to be a quiet flu season, and hopefully it will remain that way. Those of you who listen to my rants over at Science-Based Medicine, actually you read them at Science-Based Medicine and listen to them on the Quackcast, know how little respect I have for the Cochrane reviews when it comes to influenza treatment and vaccination. Especially their poo-poo of Tamiflu, aka oseltamivir, and its alleged worthlessness. You can listen to those podcasts over on the Quackcast. The bottom line, though, is prompt treatment of influenza with oseltamivir decreases the odds of death in a variety of studied populations. Also, in the elderly, in this study in clinical infectious diseases, those who had prompt treatment of their influenza, i.e. less than 2 days, had shorter hospital stays and had less need for after-discharge care in care facilities. So if you got treated right away, you were less likely to have to go to a nursing home at discharge, which is a good thing for anybody. I still think there are multiple populations in which oseltamivir has benefit. The group it has the least benefit is those who it's been tested on in randomized controlled trials, which are primarily healthy people in the outpatient setting. But again, I can rant for hours on that. One of the other questions that frequently comes up is how long does antibody last after getting an influenza vaccine? The changes in the virus every year, antigenic shift and antigenic drift, ensure that we probably need to get a new vaccine every year. But if the same strain is circulating, don't we have protection? Question mark? So they looked at antibody titers in healthy adults who were having a trial for inactivated versus live attenuated vaccine and found that they had fairly persisting antibody levels. It took about 600 days to get a twofold decrease in antibody titer, which is about, 365 days a year, almost 2 years. So you do get persisting antibodies after the vaccine. The problem, of course, is that the virus changes. And interestingly, and I probably just can't find it, I could not find an article to suggest a booster effect from the yearly vaccine that we recommend, which one would think would happen. It's probably there, I just can't find it. And you have gotten your flu shot, right? I don't deal much with acute hepatitis. There's the ABCDE that causes hepatitis, and EBV and CMV. But even despite knowing all these different etiologies behind acute inflammation of the liver, up to 30% of patients with acute viral hepatitis have no known reason. So they took a bunch of patients with hepatitis of unknown etiology who had had the standard workup, and they performed magic on them. What is magic? Well, that's sequence-independent complementary DNA amplification and next-generation sequencing, which was the sequel to Star Trek, I think. And they found that hepatitis B and hepatitis E were found in these patients, so that a subset of patients with hepatitis of unknown etiology by standard testing, if you do magic upon them, you will find hepatitis B, 58% in this study, and hepatitis E, 16% in this study. So the take-home is that our clinical lab needs to be able to perform more magic. It's wintertime, and of course in the West, people go to Arizona to get away from the cold and drizzle. I think on the East Coast, everybody goes to Florida. I don't know which would be worse in terms of infectious diseases. Currently, there's an ongoing outbreak of two different flaviviruses. That's flaviviruses. West Nile and St. Louis encephalitis virus. Both of these viruses are spread by the same mosquito, and as of November 2015, there have been, 117 cases of encephalitis in Arizona reported, 75 West Nile, 19 St. Louis encephalitis, and 23 unspecified. That's a lot of encephalitis in Arizona. And if it's been going on for a while, might explain how McCain picked Palin for a running mate, because there's no way a person without encephalitis would make a mistake like that. We don't have yet any of the encephalitic viruses here in the Great Pacific Northwest, which explains perhaps our more rational political system. Not. Seriously, any state legislature that makes naturopaths the equivalent of primary care physicians and gives them full prescribing rights doesn't know what the hell they're doing. I personally have no doubt that infections can induce long-term symptoms in patients. The infection comes and goes, but something happens. Some switch is thrown, and patients have persisting non-specific symptoms. I think of it like a rock being thrown into a pond, the rock being infection, the ripples being the post-infectious complaints. Lyme is one of those diseases where people can get post-treatment disease symptoms, and they can persist for long periods of time. They're nonspecific and include things like fatigue, feverishness, headache, myalgias, decreased memory. How common, however, is post-treatment Lyme symptoms in patients who have Lyme disease? And this is a study that was done in people with culture-confirmed early Lyme disease, not the unreliable serologies that you can get throughout the United States. See the recent FDA warning on the fact that Lyme serologies are not always trustworthy. But they did find that 10% of patients in this group who had adequate treatment for their Lyme had ongoing possible post-treatment Lyme disease symptoms. But it was over time decreased to around 5%. And the majority of these only had a single symptom. They also found it was not associated with a particular serotype of the Borrelia. So it is rare, it happens, but there are patients who, after Lyme disease, have ongoing nonspecific symptoms, but fortunately at low rates after adequate treatment. The bugaboo I have currently is people with FTA positive, RPR negative blood work with symptoms that may or may not be consistent with syphilis. Do they have treated syphilis? Or could this be a cross-reaction with another spirochete, such as Lyme disease? If so, how often does that happen? Well, if you have syphilis, you can have a false positive Lyme. But if you have Lyme, you don't get a false positive syphilis. Since I am fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to practice in a state with no Lyme disease or virtually no Lyme disease, I will probably be unable to remember these results. It's a good thing I have an app that I can put this in. So syphilis can cause a false positive Lyme, but Lyme does not cause a false positive syphilis. Although I still think my CSF syphilis serology is a false positive. My dementia has to have a different etiology. Welcome to the TMI Puscast. And now I know someone's going to say, Crislip has syphilis. I don't. All that glitters is not gold. All that is swollen cheeks is not necessarily mumps virus. A couple of studies out to demonstrate that influenza A can cause a mumps-like syndrome in children. I don't usually present diseases of children with this podcast. I am an adult infectious disease doctor, whom I take care of, not how I behave. But there are a variety of other viruses that can cause a mumps-like illness besides mumps and influenza. And those include EBV, HHV6, HPIV2, and even human Boca virus in one patient. So there are a variety of viral etiologies that can cause mumps, and just because your patient who isn't vaccinated has swollen parotid glands doesn't necessarily mean they got the mumps. When people crowd together, they spread infectious diseases. The Hajj is good at spreading respiratory infections. But how about the Olympics? Well, they checked it out in London and in Weymouth during, Weymouth. Maybe it's Weymouth or Weymouth. Who knows how the English pronounce their cities? Anyway, they looked at the rates of people visiting STD clinics during the Olympics, and they discovered that visitors to the Olympics only increased the number of visits to their STD clinics by 1%. That's not much, but perhaps they just took it home. Infections do have incubation periods, and perhaps the Olympic visitors who got their STDs took off home to get treated rather than hung around in London to get treated. But still, only 1%. That's not much. Now they need to do the same rates at NASCAR and PGA events. I bet you the NASCARs kick ass when it comes to STDs. And beware of tularemia. Cases have markedly increased for some reason, maybe global warming, maybe not, in Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. The way you get tularemia is, one, have contact with the tularemic animal. Another is bug bites, and there's pretty clear data to show that tularemia is spread by bug bites. But my personal favorite is what they call aerosolization. So when you are out landscaping or mowing over voles and rabbits, you basically puree the animal and aerosolize it into the air, where you suck it into your lung and get pulmonic tularemia. There's a classic series in the New England Journal of Medicine from like 20, 30 years ago, and I saw a similar case of pulmonic tularemia that I traced back to the fact he liked to mow big fields filled with rabbits. Sort of the rodent equivalent of Bassomatic. For those of you who do not know the Bassomatic, it's an old Saturday Night Live skit. Log on the interwebs and watch Dan Aykroyd at his demented best. And it's also my favorite song. You know, Tularemia. It's an Irish lullaby. Believe me, I'm not going to sing for you. Count your blessings. Acinetobacter pneumonia is a bad thing. This retrospective study demonstrated a 30-day mortality of about 50%, especially if it was a carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter. But here's what gets me about this study. This study had 356 cases of nosocomial/ventilator-associated pneumonia in one institution, a 600-bed hospital in Turkey. I would suggest that they have a lot worse problems than just having resistant Acinetobacters if they have that many nosocomial pneumonias. We get 1 a year or 2 a year in our system, and Acinetobacters, even in the trauma and burn unit, are virtually unheard of. Something tells me that at Uludag University Hospital, they ain't washing their hands. Really, 356 with that organism in a 600-bed hospital. It boggles the mind. And why would you publish that? I don't understand sometimes why what seems to be horrible infection control practice is not noticed and then published. I really wish I could get more PET scans, but they are prohibitively expensive in the United States and are often not paid for unless you're looking for cancer. There's a variety of infections that glow like Chernobyl when you get a PET scan, and one of them would appear to be prosthetic valve endocarditis. Now, there was a small number of patients in this study, 16 with prosthetic valve and 7 with native valve, and the PET scan was really good at picking up patients with endocarditis. There's often wondering if patients with prosthetic valve have the disease. Of course, there are false positives and false negatives with every test, but if you had a negative TEE, it might be beneficial to get a PET scan in working up a patient with prosthetic valve endocarditis, assuming you can get it paid for. I've always thought it was stupid to treat fevers. Now, sometimes there are metabolic reasons to give patients an antipyretic. they have a bad cardiac output and can't tolerate a temperature of 104, for example. But fevers exist for a reason. They occur in all animals that can make a fever, will make a fever in response to an infection, and virtually all wings of the immune system work better at higher temperatures. Plus, many organisms can't grow at 102 and 103. It's also kind of stupid to say, oh, your temperature should be 98.4, so let's decrease it to that. It'd be like if somebody came in with a respiratory problem and they were breathing at a rate of 30, and you go, no, your respiratory rate should be 12, so we're going to make it 12, whether it is a good idea or not. So is there benefit from treating fever? I've never found a study that showed benefit from treating fever. There are a lot of studies to show either nothing, or in some pediatric and viral-like illnesses, patients are sicker a day longer when you treat fevers. This study hypothesized that acetaminophen would be beneficial, don't know why, with fewer ICU-free days. So they compared patients to Tylenol versus placebo and found that Tylenol did nothing, which doesn't surprise me in a septic patient. Given the overwhelming physiologic derangements, I would think that a little bit of Tylenol would be like pissing on a forest fire. But again, if you are treating fevers in the ICU and it shows no benefit, then all you have is the potential for harm. And that certainly seems to be the case with acetaminophen. Similarly, they looked at a randomized trial using Tylenol in patients with influenza, and they found that it had no effect on viral shedding, temperature, or clinical symptoms in PCR-confirmed influenza, which I think is interesting. I would have bet that patients who got an anti-fever medication would have been sicker longer, but at least in this population, Tylenol did nothing. So for ICU infections and influenza, the best you can say for Tylenol, acetaminophen, is that it does nothing, but will add cost and the potential for both side effects and drug-drug interactions. To date, I have yet to see a good reason to treat fevers in infected patients except for comfort, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So toughen up. And that's it. That is a quickie this month. Sometimes I download 200 articles. Sometimes I download 50. Sometimes even less. It's really interesting how variable interesting articles are on the infectious disease literature. And for the record, I go over about every month 2,000 articles, at least their titles, for this select few that make it to the Puscast. Anyway, this will be the last one of 2015. I will be back New Year's weekend, 2016, to thrill and amaze you with more pus. Otherwise, don't forget to go to edgydoc.com for links to my growing multimedia empire and buy the Pus Whisperer for your friends and family this year. That's the least you can do. Well, actually, the least you can do is to write me good reviews on iTunes. Well, actually, the least you can do is nothing, which is what you're probably going to do. Otherwise, thank you as always for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I shall continue to follow along. Thank you. In dictation, goodbye.